Hello, this is Dr. Mears. Today we are going to learn about the probability of flipping two coins. Before we start flipping two coins, let's just remember the probabilities with one coin. So our sample space is our total number of outcomes. Our sample space here are heads and tails. So if we just had one coin, we would either have heads or tails. The probability of flipping a heads is 1 out of 2 because there's only one heads out of 2 total outcomes. That gives us a probability of 0.50, which is a 50% chance we flip heads. Probability of tails, there's only one tails out of 2 outcomes, so 1 divided by 2, which is 0.50, which again is 50% chance, but this time of flipping tails. Let's now move on to two coins. First, when we move on to two coins, we need to investigate the sample space. Each coin has a heads and a tails. Nothing different. When we have two outcomes on my first coin, so I have a heads and a tails on my first coin. I also have two outcomes on my second coin. I have a heads and a tail on my second coin. So what I'm looking to do is I'm looking to flip my first coin and get a heads or tails, and flip my second coin and get a heads and tails. This and in probability means multiplication. So if I have two outcomes times two outcomes, my sample space should be 4 total outcomes. Well, let's investigate. So here we have what can happen with our two coins. So here I have heads and heads. So the first coin can come up heads and the second coin can come up heads. So we have heads and heads. Heads on the first and heads on the second. We then could toss a heads and a tails. Heads on first, tails on second. We could also do it the opposite. We can do tails on first and heads on second. Or they can both land tail sides up. So let's see how many outcomes in total we have. 1, 2, 3, 4. We were correct using our and means multiplication. So our sample space thus is heads, 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 tails, tails, heads, and tails, tails. Please notice I'm using H for heads and T for tails, as we said up in this piece here. So my total number of outcomes is 4. So that's what we have to remember. Moving on to some probabilities. Remembering that my sample space is 4, let's find the probability that we both flip heads. So heads on the first and heads on the second. Well, heads, heads. There are only, how many heads, heads are there here? There's only one heads, heads that comes up out of 4 total different outcomes. So that's a 1 out of 4 chance, which is 0.25. So we have a 25% chance both coins are heads. Okay. We could have also figured that out a little bit differently. Or we could have said the probability of heads on the first and the probability of heads on the second. So what we would do here is multiply. Well, we know probability of heads when we investigated one coin is 1/2. Probability of heads again when we investigated one coin is 1/2. If we use our and means multiplication rule in probability, we do 1/2 times 1/2. 1 times 1 is 1, 2 times 2 is 4, and we get 0.25, which is exactly the same as we got up here doing it using outcomes and sample size. Sample space, which is sample size. Okay, let's move on. So here we have heads, tails. Well, if we look up here in our sample space, what we see is heads, tails only comes up once in our total sample space, only one time out of 4. So that's 1 out of 4, which is 0.25. If you like doing it by listing your outcomes in your sample space and then writing down how many times that occurs out of the total number, that's fine. If you like this new rule that we're investigating, where you take the probability of heads on the first flip and then the probability of tails on the second flip and multiply them to get 1/4, that's fine as well. You come to the same answer, but just different ways. Hence, mathematics. Okay, let's take a look at everything else. So heads, tail, heads, probability of tails and probability of heads, tails on first, heads on the second, same exact thing, 0.25. Probability of tails on the first and tails on the second, same thing, 0.25. So notice they're all 0.25s. Okay, how about this one? Let's throw an or in there. I want to see, if we take a bet, we have 2 coins, and I'll bet you that they're either going to land heads, heads, or heads, tails. Well, let's check it out. For heads, heads, we know it's 1/4. We just found that out up here. Heads, heads, okay. Heads, tails, we just figured that out. That was 1/4 as well. If we have one or the other, we're finding out that our probability rule means that this is addition. 1 plus 1 is 2. Keep the denominator we're adding. We have 0.50. So that's a 50% chance that it lands on either a heads, heads or a heads, tails. You know what? 50% chance. Let's actually do it right now. 50% chance, heads, heads, or heads, tails. Let's see if I win. Oh, tails, tails. That was a bad toss right there. Okay, let's keep going on with the lesson. How about this one? Heads, heads, or heads, tails, or tails, heads, or tails, tails. Well, wait a minute. This reminds me of all of my samples in my whole entire space. So that would be heads, heads, 1/4, plus, because we have or, heads, tails, 1/4, plus, because we have or, tails, heads, 1/4, plus, because, again, we have or, tails, tails. Well, let's add these fractions together. 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 is 4. Keeping the denominator the same because we are adding. 4 divided by 4 gives you 1. So we have a 100% chance that it lands on a heads, heads, or a heads, tails, or a tails, heads, or a tails, tails. This is our sample space. And remember, if we take the probability of all of the sample space, we always come up with 1. We've been doing this a few times. Okay. So, in ending this video, let's look at our 2 new rules that we have made over last week, and now I'm solidifying them in this week's lesson. If you want to find the probability of one or the other, we add. If we want to find the probability of tossing a first and a second, we multiply probabilities. So we're now putting symbols with words. So there are 2 new cool probability rules, 2 cool new probability rules, any way you want to state it, that we have learned. We're going to be bringing these probability rules into rolling dice on Wednesday. So I will see you soon. This has been Dr. Mears, 2 cool new probability rules and flipping 2 coins. Thank you.